Hi. So I am going to present a brief sketch of a genealogy of social justice morals. So what I'm calling a genealogy of social justice morals. This is, my disclaimer is this is a sketch for a longer, much bigger project. So I'm just laying out the pieces here. And I am willing to hear anything about any of the elements that I talk about. If you have, after I finish a section, if you wish to interject or question something, I'm perfectly fine with that as long as I get to go on.
Any of this stuff, and how do you know?
So this is a sketch of a genealogy of social justice morals. And the Nietzschean reference is obviously intentional. As a growing body of scholars and public intellectuals suggest, nothing less than a moral revolution is underway in liberal society, broadly construed. The old rules of speech and behavior are giving way to a new package of moral and political imperatives. As illustrated regularly on college campuses and beyond, the advocates of this new moral creed aim to reinforce adherence to their beliefs with the ferocity of religious zealots. The political and quasi-religious creed is known as quote-unquote social justice, and the rationale for its enforcement is to protect and promote the members of marginalized identity groups. Far from being limited to a few student activists and keyboard warriors, however, the social justice creed has been adopted by a majority of North American university administrations and codified in university policies. And social justice has also traveled far afield of academia, exerting a growing influence on social media, mass media, corporate America, and other elements of the broader culture. I should make clear at the outset here that the contemporary social justice movement does not simply or clearly represent a commitment to social justice in the abstract. The movement should not be mistaken for older social justice engagements such as the Catholic Workers' Movement or C.U.N.Y, nor is today's social justice a child of the civil rights movement. While sharing some vocabulary with these apparent ancestors, this new creed actually has very little in common with them. Instead, contemporary social justice has quite different origins and represents different and quite a particular set of beliefs, and it takes an entirely different approach tactically. Social justice ideology is premised largely on intersectionality theory and includes the belief prongs of identity politics, contemporary gender theory and politics, including transgender identity and politics, queer theory and its politics, the notions of white privilege, quote unquote cisgender privilege, ability privilege, heteronormativity, rape culture, microaggressions, discursive violence, cultural appropriation, among others. The tactics, practices, and mechanisms of social justice ideologues include call-out culture, self-criticism, privilege checking, public shaming routines, no platforming of speakers, safe spaces, a ritualized vocabulary for dismissing and condemning opponents, sloganeering, chanting over others, and occasional violence. English departments served as the primary incubators of today's social justice ideology, and I can attest to this as having gone through both an MA and PhD program in English through the 90s. They also appear to, but most social justice warriors are apparently unaware of this fact. They also appear to have no idea as to the political and theoretical roots of their beliefs and tactics, which I point out briefly in this presentation. Instead, contemporary social justice can be traced to quite different cultural and political contexts, to left authoritarianism in Europe and elsewhere, and to the totalitarian regimes of the Soviet Union and Communist China. In this presentation, I will argue that with its surveillance mechanisms, shaming techniques, mob routines, bewildering anti-free speech attitude, and violent anti-intellectualism, the new social justice ideology is not a means for realizing social justice at all. Rather, for the institutions that adopt it, the doctrine conveniently provides a thin ethical gloss for increasingly illiberal policies in a neoliberal era. On behalf of those for whom it champions, social justice operates as a, quote, negative egalitarianism, primarily working to remove the privileges of some as opposed to enhancing the rights of others. Far from bringing about liberation, social justice increases repression and thus reduces overall freedom. Meanwhile, those under its sway presume to make social wrongs evaporate with the mere pronouncement of the correct shibboleths. The postmodern epistemological conviction that language constructs reality itself permits an eradication of materiality. As such, social justice ideology promises nothing more than linguistic emancipation while actually serving as a means of oppression in its own right. Thus, the social justice creed is precisely an ideology in the Marxist sense. That is, the social justice belief system presents a false, upside-down image of reality while offering no effective means for changing it for the better. Understanding the historical context of the movement is essential for deciding how to respond to it. In this presentation, I will describe the illiberal nature of the new creed by briefly tracing its historical roots. Social justice warriors, so-called, are the children of the 60s and 70s student activists become parents and professors. This story thus embeds a generational narrative, bookended by the free speech movement of the 60s and the anti-free speech movement of today. I will address the most salient question: how did we get here from there? Unlike most treatments of social justice, I offer a criticism from a left libertarian perspective, including for suggestions for how and why liberalism and the left should liberate themselves from this pernicious ideological invader. Despite its ubiquity, one would be hard-pressed to find a study that subjects social justice ideology and its panoply of apparatuses to scholarly historical examination. While countless editorials and numerous books have appeared, no one has adequately explained the theoretical and historical roots of these developments, nor has anyone provided a theoretical framework with which to understand them. Such a treatment of this movement is long overdue. I have to go into a slight personal history here because it's just, for some people, probably an elephant in the room, so I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist. For several years, I have been highly critical of identity politics and political correctness, offering Marxist analyses of these trends. My audience abruptly grew, and my critique took a sharper, more strident turn when I decided to attack the trend using public satire. Under the now notorious Twitter handle anti-PC NYU prof, I lambasted PC policing in academia and the broader culture. I critiqued higher education for adopting and enforcing social justice ideology and the coercive and self-limiting mechanisms it entails, including bias, reporting hotlines, safe spaces, trigger warnings, and the no platforming of speakers. Though mounted in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion, such practices, I argued, served only to police, disempower, and discipline, enforcing intellectual and political conformity. Social justice, I argued, represents the ideological basis of a brave new world of indoctrination and control, offering nothing like the liberation promised by the traditional left. After the publication of my interview in the Washington Square News, that's the NYU student newspaper, and the outing of the anti-PC NYU professor as myself, my critique drew a nearly instant response in an open letter issued by the Liberal Studies Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Group, which I've since dubbed the Conformity, Inequity, and Exclusion Group, whose Orwellian appellation was matched only by the doublespeak of its pronouncements. After denouncing me for the quote-unquote structure of my thinking ideology, the committee chastised me for straying from accepted liberal PC orthodoxy and literally declared me guilty of expressing the wrong kinds of thoughts. On the very same day that their open letter appeared, little did I know, as I was sitting in the dean's office, I was summoned to the dean's office and met by him and hitherto unannounced head of human resources. The upshot of the meeting was a, quote, voluntary leave of absence, supposedly owing to concerns for my mental health. During this paid medical leave, I was promoted to full professor, which led some in the media to declare that I had been vindicated in my battle with the PC police. The promotion and the kerfuffle were unrelated, however, but a negative decision certainly would have presented grounds for a discrimination case. My run-in with the PC police and subsequent developments have been covered widely in the media. I've written on the topic for several venues, including the Washington Post and many others. I've been interviewed on dozens of media outlets, and here's where I drew more ire, including One America News Network, PBS, The O'Reilly Factor, becoming one of Bill O'Reilly's very last Fox News guests. And yes, he was very, very upset and obviously anxious in between the segments. Yet such programs and their hosts often misleadingly framed my appearances and either misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented my arguments and political perspective. I intend to set the record straight here, while offering an historical analysis of social justice in order to show that it's anything but emancipatory. In a recent conversation about campus illiberalism and my role in assailing it, Jonathan Haidt, a fellow colleague at NYU, social psychologist and author of The Righteous Mind and founder of Heterodox Academy, told me that the social justice movement is nothing less than a religious fundamentalism, and that the fervor of its believers matches, if not outstrips, that of the religious fundamentalist right of the 1980s. My conversation with Haidt led me to recall my scholarship on 19th century British secularism. It's what I'd worked on for years, especially the legal persecution and social censure that the earliest secularists endured at the hands of religious bigots and legal prosecutors. While the persecution for my defection has paled in comparison, and now an analogy was clear. In the frenzied religious environment of the early 21st century PC academic culture, I was a new kind of secularist, and I advocated a new secularism. What is social justice and how does it operate? Social justice should now be understood as a dominant ideology. That is, as an ideology that serves the interests of power, whatever it accomplishes for those it supposedly champions. From this understanding, it follows that one should undertake the kind of ideological and historical analyses usually employed by the academic left and reserved for the study of almost exclusively rightist doctrines. Such analyses, I argue, should now be turned back on the academic and social justice left themselves. Social justice is also more than an ideology. It is also a set of tools and a way of behaving in the world that corresponds somewhat to an ethical system. Yet it lacks the coherence of a fully elaborated ethics like utilitarianism, for example. Each of the strands of the social justice matrix has its own storied history, which I examined briefly. Many of the beliefs of social justice ideologues, which now form the basis of academic and non-academic policies, are implicit and held as nearly inscrutable. Thus, social justice comes closer to a religious creed than it does to a formal ethical system. The significance of this understanding is that any attempts to counter or negotiate with social justice ideology or ideologues are likely to be met with hostility and reproach. Indeed, social justice ideologues and apologists are quick to condemn critics of any stripe as racist, homophobes, transphobes, fascists, or even Nazis, regardless of their avowed political orientation. The Maoist roots of privilege checking and call-out culture. To begin a genealogy of social justice, I trace some of these techniques and movements to the late 1960s. My search for plausible precursors to the privilege checking and call-out culture of social justice milieus led to post-1968 French feminists who read Mao's Little Red Book and imbibed a Maoist ethos, incorporating ideological purging elements of the Cultural Revolution, such as struggle sessions and auto-critique or self-criticism. In struggle sessions, the guilty party accused of selfishness, ignorance, and the embrace of bourgeois ideology was pilloried with verbal and often physical assaults by her comrades, until she broke down and confessed her characterological and ideological flaws. and then pledged self-reform or else faced imprisonment and possible death. Meanwhile, autocritique began with the guilty party, who subjected herself to brutal verbal self-inspection and derogation before the jury of her peers. As for safe spaces, they have a benign enough provenance. Maura Kenny, in Mapping Gay LA, has traced the concept of gay and lesbian bars of the 1960s in Los Angeles and elsewhere, from which the notion made its way into feminist circles. As such, they became spaces free of men and patriarchal thought and expression. In colleges and universities, however, they serve to protect students and others from ideas deemed triggering or otherwise harmful. I have argued that in the context of higher education, safe spaces constitute a means of self-imposed cultural containment, not unlike that decried by the novelist Ralph Ellison, writing in reply to the social critic Irving Howe, whom he wrote, sought to consign him to a corked jug of cultural isolation, not unlike that of the Jim Crow South. These practices, modified, of course, and transmuted mostly into an exclusively rhetorical character, have infiltrated not only academia, but social media, where the practices of privilege checking, call-out culture, and dogpiling are often exercised with a particular ferocity. Given that these practices have been undertaken in face-to-face settings and often to more substantive and horrific conclusions, the vindictiveness shown by social justice ideologues cannot be explained away by the relative anonymity and distance afforded by the internet. Although the digital realm does provide some cover, social justice carries on even in face-to-face encounters, as we see every day. And its advocates within universities who practice these routines with the implicit endorsement of university administrators, the liberal and Marxist progenitors of no platforming. I now turn to the practice of no platforming, or the refusal on the part of students and other activists to allow speakers to have a platform or a stage to voice their views. I have tracked the history of this practice on campuses and elsewhere, and find its provenance in the theoretical discussions of two main thinkers, the Marxist Frankfurt School theorist Herbert Marcuse and the liberal philosopher of science and society, Karl Popper. In his Repressive Tolerance, Marcuse argued against pure tolerance for the refusal to allow speakers and other promulgators of intolerance to have a platform for promoting their views. Thus, tolerance required the abolition of views deemed intolerant. Some speech and expression must be stopped, and the left is correct and even obligated to stop it. A similar, though less illiberal position known as the paradox of tolerance was developed by the philosopher Karl Popper. My argument is that Marcuse's stance represents a slippery slope, establishing as it does a tribunal of censorship consisting of ideologically charged activist milieus. It effectively means that illiberalism must be a characteristic of quote-unquote liberal society. This principally represents a contradiction and fails to consider the strong possibility that, sooner or later, the continually narrowing Overton window will close on the speech of the very people who sought to bar the speech of others. In any case, one must wonder, just who is fit to be the arbiter, and what makes them and not others the interpretive conscience of society, suited to banned expression they deplore? In our contemporary moment, the strange irony is that these arbiters aim to foreclose lines of inquiry that they have never even directly considered or encountered. But if they had, the irony would even be greater. The arbiters would have survived, and so wouldn't others. Marcuse's advocacy of social and legal intolerance towards supposed intolerances reproduces the very repression that he lamented and hoped to prevent. And one wonders just how he managed to arrive at such conclusions as early as 1965. Not that he was prescient. A prominent communist theorist, had he already completely forgotten the McCarthy hearings? Postmodernism, neoliberalism, and the birth of trigger warnings and microaggressions. Underlying the concern for offensive language in social justice ideology is the belief that language can materially harm others. Language is also considered to effectively displace materiality. To explain this belief, I have turned to the postmodern and other recent theories of language. And I draw on Frederick Jameson's critical assessment of structuralism in The Prison House of Language, 1975, to begin a treatment of the precursors to the postmodern language theory in structuralist linguistics. I then move to consider notions of discursive power as theorized by French historian and philosopher Michel Foucault. It seeks another source in Derrida's deconstruction, of course. Trigger warnings and microaggressions are only explicable in connection with these continental structuralist, post-structuralist, and deconstructionist understanding of language as material power and as constructing material reality. I have begun to compare these continental language theories with the understanding of language that underwrites classical liberal theory and law, including the US Constitution's understanding of expression and protection of it. The contradictions between classical liberalism's presuppositions about language and the explicit claims of postmodern language theory go a long way in making sense of the ongoing conflicts between free speech advocates and social justice ideologues and administrators who enact social justice-inflected policies. The New Left and intersectionality theory. This was probably the most controversial thing I'll say, if you can believe it. Certainly, much of the social justice arsenal and ethos has been inflected by intersectional feminism. Intersectionality provides the architectural blueprint for the kind of subaltern status seeking that we encounter in social justice ideology and groups. Developed in the 1970s, intersectionality seeks to describe how power intersects identities along various axes, including those of race, gender, sexuality, sexual preference, ability, and more. It aims to locate the articulations of power as it traverses various subordinated peoples in different multiple ways. Suggestive of a radical critique of patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy, which its adherents see as distinct yet interconnected forms of domination, it complicates any sense of gender, sex, class, or race as homogeneous wholes, and it problematizes any hierarchy of one categorical determination over others, which is all good. Yet in practice, intersectionality serves to isolate multiple and seemingly endless identity standpoints without sufficiently articulating them with one another. The upshot in political practice is an endless splitting of categories, with the members of each category vying for more subaltern than thou status. Intersectionality is no doubt the source of what has been derogatorily referred to as the oppression Olympics by unsympathetic observers, some of whom may have once competed in the games themselves, and they have. My conclusion and recommendations for reform, and I start with the university and suggest that from the university, where all of this began, the changes could emanate from outward. In conclusion, I return to the understanding of social justice as a religious creed and consider possible means for reforming institutions that have adopted it, as well as for undermining its influence in the broader culture. Given that social justice ideology can be considered religion, any successful change will necessarily involve a secular alternative. I have considered possibilities for a new kind of secularism in the university from where it is hoped broader social change may emanate. To consider the question of a newly secular university, I return to my work on historical secularism. Contrary to received notions, as originally conceived and founded by George Jacob Holyoake in 1851 in Britain, secularism did not signify the absence or negation of religion. Rather, the secular indicated a substantive category in its own right, a complement to the religious. Holyoake imagined and fostered the coexistence of secular and religious elements subsisting under a common umbrella known as secularism. For Holyoake, the secular and religious were figured as complementary and co-constituting aspects of what we might now call an overarching secularity, but which Holyoake called secularism. Secularism was introduced not as a counter to religion per se, but rather to atheism. I argue in the conclusion here that what is needed in the university is not a negative secularism like that undertaken by the subsequent leader of the secularist movement, Charles Bradlaugh. Bradlaugh believed that secularism represented the abolition of religion and the belief in atheism. Holyoke secularism, on the other hand, is compatible with contemporary notions of what is now called post-secularism. An ambiguous and contested term, post-secularism, may signify a skepticism or antagonism toward the hard secularism of Bradlaugh, or you might say also the new atheist in the contemporary context, in recognition of the persistence or resurgence of religion. It refers to an attempt to overcome the antinomy of secularism/religion such that both are granted recognition under a common umbrella. I'm getting to the point here, you'll see. Post-secularism recognizes the persistence of religion and marks an acknowledgement of a religious and secular pluralism. It recognizes the ethical resources and community-building efficacy of religious bodies and countenances the function of religion in constructing and defending cultural identities. The recommendations of this conclusion are for the reconceptualization of the university and the broader culture in post-secular terms. That is, reform should not involve an attempt to eradicate the social justice creed or to drive its believers to the margins where they believe, falsely I think, that they already reside. If history is any indication, it shows that attempts to eradicate religion have not only failed but also backfired, ending by strengthening that which they sought to abolish. The contemporary religiosity of Russia is one so obvious example. A state where religion had been legally abolished and under which the state was officially atheist. Instead of recommending such an approach, I argue that successful reform will necessarily allow social justice beliefs to remain within a broader cultural matrix of possible creeds, including secular and other religious ones. The post-secular dispensation calls for balancing the religious and secular perspectives within the same political, public, and educational spheres. Only by admitting social justice belief as one of many other possibilities will the university and the broader culture successfully absorb this creed without becoming literal hostages to it, as we've seen at Evergreen State. It must institute newly post-secular policies and adopt what would amount to post-secular language and concepts. That is, the university and the broader culture must transcend, while nevertheless including social justice within its ambit. Social justice must become a belief subordinated to a higher level secularity under which it is one of many options, but not the official arbiter of behavior, language use, morality, pedagogy, or policy. Thank you.
All right, so new thought, please. Thanks for coming. Let me begin the show here. With that's a good one. So that's important. That's the definition of bigot. Person who's intolerant towards those holding different opinions. Literally the dictionary definition of a social justice warrior. It's a bigot, basically. Free speech is the cornerstone of our society. It's the number one cornerstone. It was John Stuart Mill who said that a person who doesn't know the other side of the story doesn't even know his own side of the story. You have to know both sides of the story before you can even understand whether your side of the story is fully legit or not. I'll go through some of the presuppositions here. The purpose of this ruling power structure is to keep and maintain their grip on power, to keep the status quo. They seldom risk massive social changes, because there's always this uncertainty as to what the results may be with such a radical change. So if we see a radical change in society, it's probably because the ruling class wanted that. Americans are not known to rise up. They sit and they do what they're told most of the time. The ruling power structure tends to tighten laws, not relax them. And so what we've seen over the years, they make more laws, or they make them more restrictive, or they make punishments more draconian. Seldom do we see the opposite, especially on things relating to human sexuality and drugs. So if these laws are relaxed, we have to ask why. Because again, the people don't have the strength to get if you know about how America works, you know that it's fundamentally based on these Christianized mores on sexuality, and politicians, they just do what they've done all along. They keep the status quo going, and politicians don't budge. So if we're seeing movement on things like transgendered rights, for example, that's one example. Transgendered organizations don't contribute to politicians. The Christian Coalition gives, and the various liberty lobbies and all the Christian, it's about $1 billion or more they give to the political class, right? Politicians do what they get paid to do. And so if we're seeing laws, we have to ask ourselves, what's behind it? Is this really the will of the people? Is this really where our society's going? And I support them all, right? But I'm not sure that's why we get them. So yeah, anyone who's been around for the last 2,000 years knows that the principal prohibitions in society are centered around human sexuality. They prohibit murder and theft, yeah. Oh, only for us, not for them. They can murder and steal at will. But murder and theft are not the centerpiece of control. Human sexuality is. And you could say Christianity has as its core belief the restriction on human sexuality. That's basically what Christianity is based on, or what it's become. It's about restricting sex. When you confess to a sin, that sin is not murder or theft, or you bounce a check. It's a carnal sin. You've sinned in the flesh. That's what it is all about here. The ruling power structures only act in their best interests, seldom in the best interests of society. They don't do anything because it's the right thing to do. They do it to enrich their portfolios. That's what they do. Politicians make decisions which are best for his own personal career, not for the public good. Sometimes there's some corollary benefit for the public. So maybe what comes to mind is like public works projects. So say bridges, roads, and dams and stuff. Well, the society needs bridges, roads, and dams, but that's not why we get them. We get them because the politician's the luckiest day in his life when he gets to say, we need this bridge, and then he doles out the contracts and he gets the kickbacks either immediately or sometime in the future. But a politician who resides over a massive bridge building project, his future and the future of his family is guaranteed. So wars work the same way. The lobbyists for the defense industry and the powerful lobbies, like Israeli lobby, for example, they're much more powerful than lobbyists for bridges and roads. So we don't get the bridges and roads on a federal level. We get wars. And there's no limit to people who we can victimize, poor nations that we can go target for this need to have war. Yeah, the ruling powers structures don't have to give you anything that they don't want to. Let's face it. At this point in the American history, there's nothing that compels politicians to do anything, right? Other than oppress us, steal everything they can, right? There's no evidence that the people are going to rise up. Americans don't rise up. They had a chance to when, for example, the NSA, when we had the revelations of massive NSA surveillance, and clearly laws were broken, and clearly Clapper had lied in Congress. You know, when you lie in Congress, you're supposed to go to jail. That's one of the most serious offenses you can commit. And we had them. The laws were clearly broken. There was no protests, zero, nothing. The left was silent about it. And why were they silent? Well, CNN had orchestrated all these man in the street interviews where they said, oh, well, what do you think about the NSA? And they said, well, you know, if I'm not doing anything wrong, I have nothing to worry about, you know? And so we had a chance to nip the surveillance state in the butt. We did nothing. Right? That was the left's responsibility to do that, too. Because it's the left's responsibility to do things like be anti-war and to be anti-government. Now, if you want anti-war and anti-government, you have to go to the Tea Party. Good job, left. Leaving it to the Tea Party. Fuck you. The contributions to senatorial and congressional campaigns, like I say, from transgendered groups was negligible, right? Nothing. So why this rapid transformation? And I'll say this, too. Most liberation movements, women's liberation movement took 100 years. You know, black liberation, black civil rights took 150 years. Transgendered movement took months. Why? Months. From almost inception to being codified into laws. And I'll tell you why later on. You see, socially, most Americans are practically in a Neolithic state. Cavemen and women. If they're not evangelical Christians, which is like 28% of the American population, evangelical, they're certainly not an advanced society socially. And like I say, the political and corporate institutions are still dominated by Christian values and mores. And the proof of this is that the female breast is still not permitted on television or in parks or in public. Whereas you go to Europe and tits everywhere on the television. And even in states like New York, where they have laws that permit the female breast to be exposed in public, try it, you get arrested, still. The law says you can walk around with your breast exposed, you will get arrested. And the city regularly has to sit the cops down and say, it's legal, guys, and they still don't get it, right? So we have to ask, is this a bottom-up movement, or all these things that are changed, all these changes in society, are they coming because there's such this groundswell of grassroots support from the bottom, or are these top-down agendas being improved? And I say it's top-down, and I'll go into the reasons why. Divided nation paradigm. The ruling power structures need to keep society at a roughly 50-50 ideological split. I've been talking about this for 20 years, and this is what we're seeing. We're seeing now, since the Bush election, every single election is at a razor edge, you know? And why? Well, the reason why is simple, because, and it's terrible when you can predict what's happening, but when you see, it just happened with Gore, the election, and then it happened again with, you look at the way the election's going and you say, oh, it looks like our guy is going to win, and then just at the last moment, the bad guy wins, you know. And the reason why they do that is so that everybody gets to point their finger at the other half of society and say, they're the problem, and then, we lost fair and square, but it just builds this animosity between the two classes, the two ends of the ideological spectrum, and you have to do that. If you're a ruling class, there's so few of you. There's so few numbers of the ruling class people that unless they can get us to at each other's throat, then we might focus our attention on them. So we must always be at a 50-50 ideological split. And that's the way it's going to be from now on. They don't want one or another side of the ideological spectrum to gain too much power over the other side. The reason why is because they need it to be roughly 50-50 so that they can sit at the junction of this ideological split with their hands on the throttle of their mainstream media and their political class, and they can shift the polarities every once in a while according to which is best to their financial portfolios at the time. So we'll see it go to the right, and then we'll see it go to the left, and we'll see it go back to the right. But you know what? There's little difference, because right now The only difference between the right and left is that the left supposedly is has more sexual liberation than the right. But they are both militaristic. They're both neoliberal capitalistic, right to the core. So there's no deviation. When it comes to a war, for example, they're both pro-war, left and right. The left hasn't had a war protest since Obama's. Hasn't been one single anti-war protest, not one. And how did they achieve this? Well, this is easy. You remember the gays in the military thing that came out? Gays in the military? Well, and that was followed months later by women in battlefield roles. Yeah? So first we saw the gays in the military and women in battlefield roles. Well, gays and women were the last two groups that could be relied upon to be anti-war. Right? So if you're in the streets protesting to be included in the war, how the fuck are you going to then protest against war? The genius of a ruling class to just manipulate us like this. We're protesting to be included. And it's amazing that they've transformed what are essentially crimes against humanity, because that's what American wars are. They're no longer fought over ideological reasons. They're fought over money, to steal resources, right? And they're crimes against humanity. They've managed to magically transform them into equal opportunity ventures. And so people declared it was a victory when they allowed gays in the military. I thought it was a tragedy. I don't support gays in the military. I don't support women in the military. I don't support men in the military. I don't support the military. The left is not supposed to support the military. That's the left liberal position. We don't support war, right? So you don't protest to be included in it. Sorry. It's not an equal opportunity. It's a crime against humanity, right? Not a victory for gays. So they will dangle LGBT rights in your face, but that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters to them is Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, the profits, the oil wars. That's all they care about. Their Wall Street investment portfolios. LGBT rights is just a cover. That's a cover to make us feel like they're a good government, to make us feel like we're getting something. Same with marijuana liberalization. I'm all for marijuana liberalization. I'm all for LGBT rights. Don't get me wrong, okay? But that's not why we're getting them. We're getting them as a diversion. We're getting marijuana liberalization because they know that the kind of people that smoke marijuana are the same kind of people that are against the government. So if you're smoking marijuana, you're not at the protest. You're in your basement eating Ben & Jerry's, right? So that's what's going on. Right? The ruling class historically uses issues such as race, gender, sexuality as wedges that they can drive right through the center of society to create this split that I was talking about earlier. And that's why during presidential campaigns, that's the only time we hear they drag out the abortion issue. Every 4 years for the presidential race, we get the abortion struggle. And then when that's over with, you don't hear about it, as much. We're hearing about it because Trump's getting pressure from his idiotic supporters to do it. But generally speaking, it's a wedge issue, only dragged out during presidential election times. And of course, there's no better way to split the American population right down the middle than to mandate transgendered bathrooms in elementary schools. Don't get me wrong. Disclaimer here, I'm all for transgender bathrooms in elementary schools. Yes, I support that. But that's not why we have them. We have them because if you mandate transgender bathrooms in elementary schools throughout America, you are guaranteed this 50-50 split. You're guaranteed to get society at each other's throat. That's a guarantee. There's no two ways about it, right? So unless you first break the grip of Christianity has on the laws and sexual mores of this country, you'll never get progress on these issues. If they can, they will. This is one of my major theories. If they can, they will. So what does that mean? Whatever the ruling power structure can do, they will do it. And so that means they already have done it, right? So every weapon systems that has ever been conceived has been built and has been used. Nuclear bomb, discovered that they could build it. They quickly did, and they quickly used it, even when we didn't need to, right? And the same principle can be applied to programs that manipulate society. So they discovered that it was possible in the 50s to create a Manchurian assassin, Project MKUltra. That's not a loony conspiracy theory, that's a fact. And they did so. And then we have Robert F. Kennedy assassinations, some very suspicious candidates where assassination where the people were just literally didn't know what they were doing. And they look into the Robert F. Kennedy assassin, Sirhan. He was a programmed assassin. Project Mockingbird, they could infiltrate and control the media, and they did infiltrate, control the media, and they do so to this day. That's what manufacturing consent's all about. Chomsky's, well, Walter Lippmann came up with that phrase. Spiral of silence. This is what we're dealing with nowadays. This is the principal problem here, the spiral of silence. It's a book by Elizabeth Noel Newman, amazing book, written originally in 1974, published in 1980. Get that book. It's hard to get, actually. It's not in print. Spiral of Silence. Pick it up. Read it. You can skip the first chapters because they're about the German election. But it goes into how we think and how we create our ideologies. Our ideologies are not developed because we undergo a rational process of weighing out the pros and cons of an issue, or because we have an experience about this or that thing and then we make our mind. No, that's not how our ideology. Our ideologies are formed out of fear of being alienated from the group. Right? That's why we build our belief systems. It's based on fear. You're afraid to deviate too much from the prevailing ideology. And this book also talks about that if you have an opinion that is contrary to the prevailing opinion, you will not share that opinion, at least not in public. He knows a little bit about that. So do I. I've been shut down before for having an opinion that deviates. But in private, in an anonymous survey, you will give the truth, generally, and they proved that. And lately and also how. Here's an example. I'll make it up. But if you have a debate between debater A and debater B, and then X is the moderator, he's going to determine who won the debate. And you had A has his audience, and B has his audience in the crowd, and they're going to debate. If debater A has more commonality to X, the guy who's going to judge, or if they're from the same town, or they even physically look similar, have physical similarities, that no matter how good the argument from debater B is, no matter how logical, X is going to go with A every time, pretty much. That's how it works. So we are partisans, basically. And that's what we're seeing nowadays. People are so, the divide is, we're just partisans. We will actually lie as long as it supports our group. Because inclusion in the group, that's the number one thing. And alienation from the group is the number one fear. Ideology. Nowadays, ideologies, what we're seeing is you cannot deviate 1 millimeter from the ideology. So on the left, you have a complete set of beliefs, and if you don't agree with every single one of those, right? Not so much on the right? There is actually room for debate, but not on the left. On the left, you toe the line, and you don't deviate 1 fucking millimeter from the program. That's really scary. And that means that it's not an ideology, it's a club. Right? Because an ideology, you arrive to it via a reasoned process. And I'll tell you, I've never seen an ideology or a belief system or a political party that I agree 100% with. Who does? There's always something that you don't agree with, right? There's always some little element of something that you can't agree with, right? But not so. On the left, you are demanded to toe the line. And if you have any disagreements, you're shunned. And we saw this with, and this is how the left is cannibalizing itself. And I'm saying that these methodologies are designed specifically for the purpose of destroying the left. That's where I'm heading with all this stuff. That this kind of stuff is the kind of stuff that's developed in these Washington think tanks like American Enterprise Institute and places like Heritage Foundation. Well, I would say right now, this stuff, all this social justice stuff, looks like it's coming out of AIE, American Enterprise Institute, and some covert working group out of that they unleash this rubbish. And then, of course, you're going to, I'm not saying that the social justice warriors are witting accomplices. No. It's easy. You're going to find, you know how easy it is to find people to self-righteously become crusaders for their cause? It's the easiest thing in the world. So they don't even know that these techniques that are being unleashed are for the express purpose of disempowering the left and ultimately destroying the left. So that's what's going on here. My advice to a brutal dictator. I'm flying around a little bit because I didn't have time to put this thing together, and I could talk for 50 hours, so I had to just go through a list of notes. So, advice for a brutal dictator. If you're a brutal dictator, here's my advice, and you want to slaughter tens of thousands of your own people, and you don't want to hear a peep out of the American left about your brutal slaughter of your people, just say you're for LGBT rights before you do it. And left, you've satisfied the requirement of the left. You are free to kill en masse, and you will not hear a peep out of them because you supported LGBT rights. Maybe open up a tattoo parlor in San Francisco, New York, and you'll have an easy time. Origins of anti-free speech. Herbert Marcuse, he spoke of it. Go read Repressive Intolerance. It's a small essay in a book called Critique of Pure Tolerance. I borrowed that from Immanuel Kant. Repressive Tolerance. It's only about 10, 15 pages. In it, that is the blueprint for the social justice warriors, no platforming, anti-free speech. That's the blueprint for it. So he says basically that if the opinions that are, he says that if you allow free speech, basically, you're buttressing the bad guys, because the existing powers that be ultimately benefit from free speech, where the marginalized class, doesn't. And actually, another person you have to read is Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville is one of my favorites. If you read his book, Democracy in America, I think it's a terrible name, Democracy in America. The book should be called How We Are, because, well, let me tell you, this book could have been written yesterday. He was a French aristocrat who came in the 1830s. He was only 25 years old, a young man, wrote this book. And this is the most, mind-blowing book I've ever read on. It's pretty much the first book on sociology, and he talks a lot about how we're cowed into our belief systems and stuff like that. So a lot of this you can get this from the Tocqueville. The left is not permitted to discuss deep state or deep political matters, and just 5 panels here were canceled, banned. The Left Forum itself. I usually advertise my panels, so I get a lot of people. Last panel I had here, we had hundreds of people outside the room because they refused to give us a large room. And so this year I demanded a 120-person room, and I was refused. So if my panel was on LGBT rights, I would have had a large room. But since I'm talking about things that are very, very important, I mean, there's 10,000 panels on LGBT rights and 10,000 people taking gender studies. What are we going to do in a society where everybody's taking gender studies? My God, How much more is there to learn when literally hundreds of thousands of people taking gender studies? I'm all for learning about gender studies, don't get me wrong, but what is our society going to do? Build an industrial base on gender studies? You need to actually do other things, and it's just a little bit out of control. But it's the most popular thing because I guess it's an easy way out. But I don't know what you're going to do with a degree in gender studies. Seems like one of the most useless degrees. And somebody who was on the left, a woman named Kate Doyle Griffiths, who Red Bloom collective activist. I read something that she had wrote, and she had claimed that she was thanking the Left Forum for banning the deep state panels because she said that the Left Forum has previously invited TERFs, 9/11 conspiracy theorists, and anti-Semites into the event. We want the Left Forum to be a more serious space against right-wing ideology. So now 9/11 conspiracy theories, people who are investigating 9/11 are right-wingers, right? Well, I thought that the first people who were questioning 9/11 were actually from the left, not from the right. It was the right wing that did 9/11, right? So they're not going to be the ones that are, right? And it's now the left, or they're trying to get us to believe that it's right wing. It's right wing, and how dare left question 9/11, right? And of course, they lump anyone who questions 9/11 in with anti-Semitism. Well, it's not anti-Semitic. It has nothing to do with it. So what they do is these are techniques that are fostered not from the left. No way. This is a conspiracy. There you go. Use the word. The agenda of the oligarchy being picked up by the left, or I say not the left. I say this hollowed out shell, or these people posing as left. When you say left nowadays, you have to preface it because I'm saying that these like neoliberal. Yeah, well, I know, and that would be a great term, neoliberal. But unfortunately, that's hijacked over to an economic definition of. But I used to use the word neoliberal a lot, meaning like a hollowed out bullshit liberal, right? And I think we should take that term away from the economics because it's not neoliberal economics is not and it has nothing to do with neoliberalism at all. Neo-fascist economics, neoliberalism is what we're getting now on the social realm, and so now if you want to promote GMO foods, there's no better person to do that than Riley Dennis, the transgendered rights activist. He's promoting GMO foods, and you're seeing a lot of this come out. And this is coming from also a American Enterprise Institute. They put out this, they heavily promoted this amongst the social networks. And I saw it infiltrating the social networks years ago when I was having an argument with somebody who said, and this was a liberal guy. He said, all this humdrum about GMO is safe and everything. And then he showed a study. And the study showed fruits and vegetables. And they said, look at these fruits and vegetables. And they showed like these shriveled up, brown, ugly little twerpy little fruits and vegetables. And then they showed this luscious picture of fruits and vegetables. And they said, this is what fruits and vegetables would look like without genetic engineering. And this is what they look like with the genetic engineering. And the ones that were not were puny. And I said, well, wait a second. We have Renaissance painting from the 15th century, and they're gorgeous. They're more beautiful, right? Basically. So this was a covert plan to trick the left into being the champions for GMO foods. All right, and we're seeing more and more of the agenda of the oligarchy being picked up. Trust in government and media is more on the left than on the right. You see these reversals everywhere, right? A survey was done. More people on the left trust the government and support the media than they do on the right. That's stunning. It was always the domain of the left to question government. It was always the domain of the left to not trust, to distrust the government and to distrust the media. Now it's the right wing who distrusts the government. And now that's changing a little bit with Trump, but this was prior to Trump. The reversals. The reversals in our society today are staggering. staggering reversals, right? The liberal Democrats are pro-war. The right wing, that we're told, are anti-war. And if you look at Europe, all the liberal Democrat governments, so-called liberal governments, were pro-war. And then you had people like Marine Le Pen, who were called a fascist, and she was anti-war. So now the fascists are the anti-war ones, and the liberal Democrats are pro-war. Isn't that good? Isn't that nice? Liberal Democrats are pro-big business and pro-government, and it's the fascists who are against business, right? Wow. Look at that. That's pretty good. NSA surveillance, like I said before, it's cool with liberals, but it's not cool with the conservatives. That's a swap. It was always the conservatives that were the surveillance ones and the liberals who were against it, right? So the reversals are staggering. The left always proclaimed that things were not good during presidential elections, right? If you go back to, I'm old enough to remember Ronald Reagan's, where his challenger was saying, "Oh, things are not good in America," and he said, "No." He put his commercials, "Morning in America, everything's good here." Yeah? Well, now it was Trump that said things are not good in America. It was Hillary Clinton that said, "Oh, no, Trump is trying to tell you all that everything's bad and everything's good in America." That was Clinton, right? Piece of shit. And oh yeah, she's a slithering piece of shit, that woman. I hate her guts. And I periodically I periodically search her name because I'm hoping like she gets some kind of cancer or some kind of, I'd love to find something that causes a lot of suffering for this woman, because she was personally responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of women and children in countries. And when you in the Middle East countries with these wars, every one of them which she voted for, and this Libyan debacle that was her project with Libya resulted in transforming a secular nation, one that gave women's rights, one that was on the highest economic scale, a UN economic scale in Africa, highest in Africa. She transformed that into an ISIS stronghold, and that's by design, okay? Absolutely. So these people are animals. And when I would explain this to the left, when they were cheering on Hillary Clinton, I had a friend who said, "Oh, I proudly support Hillary Clinton." I said, "Wait a second, hold on. And he said, "I'm proudly supporting for her work with women and children," he said, right? Yeah. Her work with women and children amounts to the death of hundreds of thousands of women and children. And when you explain this to people on the left, they look at you with a blank stare, their eyes roll in the back of their head. They are not even aware of this kind of stuff. They don't know. Because like I say, if it's not an LGBT issue, it doesn't exist with many people. Because you know what? You know what LGBT issues are for the great many people? It's a way for the left to, this term virtue signal, it's a way for them to pat themselves on the back and say, "I'm a good person because I click like on my friend's gender reassignment transfer. Like. And they say, and they've done their job at being a good person, Oh, you're a vacuous piece of shit, because in order to be a leftist, you actually have to be anti-war too. You actually have to stand up against government. You actually have to do other things and just pat yourself on the back that you clicked like when your friend said, "I'm going to announce my gender reassignment surgery." Well, contrary to this idea that this is a really difficult decision to make, I'm sorry, the day that you announce your gender dysphoria, you will never receive more likes in your entire life. What are you talking about? This is a myth that this is. SJWs, they ignore Wall Street and the military-industrial complex. They're going after the cat caller on the street. Don't get me wrong, I hate these cat callers, but I don't think there's a lot of them, and I don't think there is much of a threat. I'll say that the threat that Wall Street poses to the average human being's life far outweighs the cat caller at the construction site. Virtue signaling raised to a level of fetish. They're all getting in on the media, government, even the military has commercials out where they're showing helicopters dropping food off to poor people. Yeah, that's what the U.S. military does. Helps the poor people now. White privilege. You have never seen a more agreeable white class right now. They're the most docile, agreeable and less threatening than we've ever had in a white privileged class, let's say. They're neutered, literally. So now is when we attack them all, when they're in full retreat, right? This is because the ruling class sees its grip on power being threatened, and they know that they have to get us to attack phantoms. And there's an analysis that most of the swastikas that were painted on buildings after the Trump election, that was not by right-wingers, that was by lefties who were embittered that they lost, most of them. So, and New York City published a hate crime study saying that hate crimes were going rampant. They said 45 hate crimes, 22 of them were, over half of them were just these swastikas. It turns out 22 of them were people shouting epithets at somebody. So out of a city of 8.5 million people, 22 people got their feelings hurt because somebody said, you dumb fuck. That's the hate crime increase. So literally non-existent. Social justice is a cover for militarism. Listen, we'll have a discussion afterwards. Helen's going to get up and speak to you. Thank you for listening.
Now, social justice warrior activism, at least from all sources that I can find that mostly agree on this, I mean, the origins are a bit murky, but it originated in these fandom communities on LiveJournal, basically this controversy known as race fail, which was around 2009. Some science fiction writers were having a discussion over how best to depict racial minority characters if they were not racial minority writers themselves, and it devolved into a total shitstorm, as things are wont to do on LiveJournal, because unfortunately these communities are magnets for, I'm going to say, groups that consider themselves oppressed, not because they're racial or ethnic minorities, but because they might have some social awkwardness, or maybe they're not considered conventionally attractive. And so they somehow take common cause with actual oppressed minorities. And it's a similar way of recruiting people for these social justice movements as ISIS is known to use. They go on social media and find these lost souls, quote unquote, and are able to radicalize them with presenting them something that seems like a great idea. Social justice, who can't get behind social justice? And unfortunately, it's taken to these ridiculous levels and becomes weaponized, and then they unleash these social justice warriors, as they became known, on the left, and basically decimate what was once a valid and powerful movement. Also, if you look at the time that the social justice warriors sort of came out, it was following the Occupy protests, which struck fear into the heart of the ruling class because they thought that they had successfully pacified the population with the twin forces of Brave New World style authoritarianism and 1984 style, basically keep them dumb and happy, and then the ones that aren't kept dumb and happy just stomp on them a little. When they saw that this was not working, and that in fact people were turning out in droves to protest the complete and utter destruction of their lives by the ruling class, they had to find some way to shut that up. So they took these disposable individuals, these marginalized, well, normally nominally white middle class, but still somehow marginalized, like I said, because of social skills, or maybe they're considered weird looking or something, but they're normal people, but they just happen to spend a lot of time on the internet. And so they gave them a cause, they sent them loose on the crusade. If it hadn't worked, they could have just thrown them away. It's like using a gun with a serial number filed off to commit the perfect murder. No one's going to trace it back to you. These people are, they're not really in the public eye, at least they weren't until they became the face of the social justice movement. Okay, and a lot of think tanks were also discussing social justice around 2009. Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and Independent Review, all for some reason came out with articles about the term social justice around 2009. A lot of them saying that it would require some form of top-down control. One of them actually used the word totalitarian. I believe that was ISI. And why would these institutes that fundamentally don't really have much to do with social justice, why would they all be discussing this at the same time that social justice warrior movement sort of took over the conversation? Now, obviously, the right wing and government agents have a long history of infiltrating and co-opting resistance movements. Everybody is pretty much aware of that fact. This particular social justice movement is no barrier to entry because it was online activism. on the internet, nobody knows you're a fraud, and it's pretty easy to sort of astroturf support for a movement or to turn a movement in a particular direction just by showing up and being the loudest voice in the room, even if it's a chat room or a message board. I mean, this was also, it was a lot easier to create fake identities 8 years ago. Now they generally try to check up on that, but they're still not really trying too hard. It's not that complex. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. If VOX went into this quite a bit, but look who the SJWs avoid targeting. They do not go after Wall Street, which is strange when you consider that this movement rose to prominence in 2008, 2009. The term social justice warrior came a little bit later, like with the Gamergate, that whole mess. But this movement was, before the term social justice warrior came into popular usage, they were already there. And why would they suddenly have forgotten about Occupy Wall Street? This was a big deal. These were people who came of age during that time. So why not target Wall Street? They're obviously responsible for the majority of oppression out there. I don't think that the white male college professor or college administrator is really the source of all your problems if you are, even if you are your average LiveJournal or Tumblr user. And yeah, Vox already went into this attacks on respected left figures. I mean, Richard Dawkins was criticized on Twitter for saying that if we were going to send a time capsule into space that had the greatest works of civilization on it, that it would be like Einstein, Schubert, and Shakespeare or something. And someone made a comment about, oh, I'm glad you think that it's all dead white males. And he said, well, no, these are just the pinnacles of what we consider Western civilization's achievements. And they pretty much crucified the guy. And yeah, class myopia, people are looking one rung above them on the economic ladder for the people they want to bring down to their level, and that's not where the oppression is coming from. I mean, like Vox said, the catcalling construction worker on the street is not the source of the problem, and the divided nation paradigm, obviously, that was already discussed. Junior Anti-Sex League. In 1984, the Junior Anti-Sex League is created because sex has the inconvenient tendency to get in the way of an individual's devotion to Big Brother, so can't have that. And that's where this whole rape culture thing is taking us, this creep of the term rape to now describe unwanted, like an unwanted fondling or a kiss or things that don't mean rape. And not only is this a total perversion of the language, but it actually discounts the experience of rape victims, re-victimizes them, because you're basically taking what they went through not very seriously. If you can just call anything rape, then actual rape is now what? It's not such a big deal? I mean, it's a pretty serious deal. And so this devaluing of the word is complete nonsense. If they are indeed coming from a place where they're trying to lessen oppression, it's not. You're actually doubling down on the oppression. And this, consent mania is completely insane. These laws now in California college campuses where you basically have to get a signed form for every article of clothing you remove, because otherwise, it's rape. I mean, and theoretically, according to this law, and anybody could come back the next day and say, well, you didn't call me, maybe it was rape. But, because there's no evidence, right? He didn't sign a form. His word against hers, and unfortunately, that's not how sex works. I mean, you make an agreement as people. You're both consenting adults. That's what consenting adults involves. But, and it also is interesting that it forms this common cause with the religious right and the patriarchy. They're the ones who are always trying to keep sex down. So if we're trying to dismantle the patriarchy, these social justice warriors, why are they also trying to keep sex down? I mean, it's just something they can't control. Well, yes. And also some of the sites that promulgate this social justice nonsense, there's this one in particular egregious perpetrator called everydayfeminism.com. I don't know if any of you have heard of that one, but it's run by this woman, Sandra Kim, who before she founded the site used to work for the Polaris Project, which was an anti-sex trafficking non-governmental organization. Now, these organizations are notorious for completely bullshitting their statistics, and sex workers hate them because makes them more difficult to do their job, basically because it's considered that even though they are consenting adults selling their bodies, because in a capitalist system, what are you going to do? They make it so that they accuse them of being victims of sex trafficking, and basically they just throw a wrench into a system that was working perfectly fine. Yes, there are people who are trafficked in the sex work industry, but the whole point of sex trafficking NGOs is to accumulate massive sums of money by completely exaggerating the problem. So Sandra Kim comes out of that. That's also a hotbed of government agents. I mean, the CIA is known to be funding a lot of those. Recently came out that the UN in Haiti, working with relief efforts, was actually like fucking all the children, and I'm sorry, that's just disgusting. And yeah, the notoriously false statistics, so this whole idea of 1 in 5 women on every college campus is sexually assaulted. Well, if you look at those statistics, the women that they talked to, most of them said they hadn't been raped and or assaulted, and that they were told they had been assaulted. So that's sort of like the reverse victimization thing. It's not just not believing the victim, it's not believing the non-victim and making them a victim. So it's going one step way too far in the wrong direction. And you also have a convergence of social justice warriors on the right with this lack of due process on campus rape charges. Basically, if somebody accuses you of rape on a college campus, you're screwed, your life is over. You can't really protest that. They've even made it so the burden of proof is now 50.01%. So that wouldn't stand up in a court of law, and indeed it is why these cases are seldom prosecuted in courts of law, because there's no way that would stand up in court. And versus zero tolerance policies, such as those creating the school to prison pipeline, if little Johnny beats up somebody in a schoolyard, then he is immediately sent off to juvenile hall, or whatever the modern day equivalent of juvenile hall is, and can expect a significant prison record in his future. So why are these two converging on this point? It's basically what this whole rape culture consent mania thing does is force you to invite Big Brother into the bedroom. A threesome with Big Brother. Now, isn't that a lovely idea? Basically, what the social justice warrior movement wants is that even if, say, you are very much in favor of gay rights, you think gay people should be able to get married, you think transgender people should have rights that are due them, you have to basically take it way too far. This creature, Riley, has this to say.
A lot of discussion around genital preferences and transphobia. In this video, I'm going to use the word cissexism. At basic, cissexism means prejudice or discrimination against transgender people. So what's been happening is that some people are making the argument that it's not cissexist at all to only be attracted to people with one kind of genitals. For example, these people might argue that being attracted to only women with vaginas in no way negatively affects trans people. On the other hand, I would argue that it's more complicated than that. We all have our implicit biases built into our preferences, and gender isn't as simple as just the genitals you have. But after I say that, I usually get a bunch of blatantly cissexist responses. So I thought I'd address all of those responses at once.
Anyway, basically what she's saying is that how dare lesbians only want to date women with vaginas? That's very sexist. And if you listen to the rest of the video, I personally find the voice a little nauseating, so I'm not going to subject you guys to it, but you can watch it for yourselves on YouTube. And that's what she's saying, is that basically...
Not just lesbians, straight men.
Yeah, straight men.
With the girl of their dreams, and there's a penis there. How dare they They should just accept it and go with the flow. That's what she said.
Yep, and that anything else is just completely bigoted and wrong, and cis sexist. So, I mean, you can support gay rights, you can support trans rights, but if you don't think that if you think that you have genital preferences for whoever you want to date or have sex with, then she doesn't care. You're totally a bigot. And that's just terrible. So,
I love science.
No, shut up. Sorry. And strange bedfellows, like he was saying before, what does this trans activist have to do with GMOs or the Mercator projection or vaccine activism? What are these topics doing on the table with this particular person? That's just bizarre. But and this is another one that has this very suspicious provenance. Her only activist credentials. For one thing, she just became a female last year and is being presented on everydayfeminism.com as one of their top feminism experts, and also somehow an expert on fat phobia. Now, look at Riley. What does this person know about fat phobia? She's tiny, and she was only a she last year. So what does she know about feminism either? I'm sorry. If you haven't at least had a while as an experience of a woman, then 1 year is not enough to make you an expert on anything. And culture also puts the left in bed with the police state, because you are running to the authorities to police slights such as microaggressions or any form of aggression. It's basically anything that is now that somebody finds hurtful or somebody thinks someone else will find hurtful. Usually it's the other, because these people, these social justice warriors, particularly the LiveJournal and Tumblr social justice warriors, are generally policing the speech because they think that some third party will find it offensive, not that they themselves find it offensive, they themselves usually being your average, white people in colleges or in their mother's basements, as the case may be. Nothing against LiveJournal and Tumblr. I used to be an avid LiveJournal user. But, shut up. Yes. Sorry, I thought that we were going to have a little longer, so I included a couple of videos in here. Anyway, what you really have to look at in this social justice warrior phenomenon is who benefits from it. It's clearly not the left. The left is tearing each other apart. The left is just completely imploding. It appears toxic and ridiculous to outsiders. If you look at the next generation growing up, not the millennials, but the one after that, called Generation Z, they are turning out as conservative in far greater numbers than their parents. And it's because the left has just basically made massive fools of themselves with this by embracing this social justice warrior nonsense. People see what it's doing and what ridiculous logical hoops you're having to jump through, and nobody wants to have their thoughts policed. Nobody wants to have their behaviors so closely policed. And people don't see an alternative, so they're turning to what? Conservatism? There's quite a big gulf in between, but because the social justice warriors have taken over, basically running into everything with a bullhorn and shouting people down, they appear to be the voice of the left, and this is not the case. This was a very small number of individuals. Now it's a small number of individuals that have influenced a larger number, and these are the unwitting dupes that both of the previous speakers talked about. That these people are completely innocent of any sort of underlying goals as far as to sabotage the left, but they don't know any better. They just found a crusade to join, and they joined it, and now they are going to finish the job, basically. And so it's a confusion and a distraction from the goals of the left, the anti-war movement, actual equality, political freedom to express one's opinion. This is now no longer the stated goals of a lot of left movements, because it's all become people just not navel gazing, but genital gazing. It's not. So this is not what we want to be doing with our political movements. We only have so much energy and we only have so much time, and this is not. We don't want to waste it. People's sights are set lower because of this whole participation trophy culture. Everybody's familiar with that term, I think. That people don't reach as high anymore because they're patted on the back for accomplishing things that used to be considered pretty basic. Like, if you complete a gender transition now, you are applauded on Facebook and get millions of likes, and people will follow you on Twitter and on YouTube. Except Riley. Nobody likes Riley. If you look on YouTube, they're the one transgender activist that you get so many thumbs down, and nobody's really interested in what this creature has to say. But nobody is writing great works of literature on the left anymore because they're all too busy playing with themselves. It's a tragedy. I mean, and you look at what's going on politically, the whole tripartite Republican control of the political system. I mean, Donald Trump claims to have won the election because basically people were sick of political correctness. Now, to what extent that's true, and to what extent it's just people are sick of Hillary Clinton, that remains up for debate. But it is true that a lot of Donald Trump voters who were interviewed in various publications said that political correctness was a big issue for them. And it's true. People have been sick of this for a long time, and which is another thing that suggests that it might be imposed from without as opposed to coming from within, because if it really was a thing that could be held up to so much ridicule, if it's been ridiculed since the early 1990s, what's it still doing hanging around? Yes, they rebranded it as social justice, but it's still the same thing, and just because they're doing it online and it's a younger generation doing it, this is the same thing that's been roundly mocked for decades now. So what is it still doing hanging around? Now, of course, the thought repression has been enshrined in academia, and it's going to be really hard to get out of there because academia is like any other bureaucracy. Once you have rules in place, it's hard to get rid of those because these things move very slowly. So the fact that things like these rape laws in the University of California system have been basically enshrined in law, things are becoming much more difficult for free speech, for just college students who want to have a normal sex life. I mean, can't have that anymore. It's kind of ridiculous. And as we know from the political correctness movement, what happens in the colleges gradually filters out into the rest of society. So it's too bad if you want to be able to have normal sex with people, because you're eventually going to have to start signing forms. And loading the language. That's a term used in cult mind control literature, that basically you are taking the meanings of words and either making them mean the opposite or making them mean something else. In cults, it's used basically to make their literature indecipherable to people who are not initiated into the mysteries of the cult. In political correctness, it's more just, I think, more to confuse and to pull the rug out from under and to make it more difficult to express ideas that they do not like. Obviously, these words, there are so many words now that are considered hurtful or just unspeakable. VOX mentioned the spiral of silence and the damage that does to just people being able to express themselves coherently and express themselves to other people. A lot of times you will get someone on the left who, if you speak to them one-on-one, they will express concern with this social justice movement and how far it's gone and the damage that it's doing to society. But if you get them in a large group, they will not say anything for fear of being shunned or excommunicated by their peers. And so the control of the language, once you control the language, the spoken language, you control the thought language, and you basically have got thought control right there, thought reform, which is the end goal of all of this nonsense. Policy papers, these are just quotes from that Heritage paper that mentioned before. Common good becomes an excuse for total state control. You can achieve the common good better if there's total authority, basically saying totalitarianism is the way to go. And the independent review, the goal is implicitly totalitarian. And also an interesting point about this promotion of victim culture. There's a lot of interesting papers having been written about that, how victim culture is replacing the dignity culture of the past by basically enshrining the oppression Olympics as the national pursuit of America. And how concentrating our attention and political resources on the least advantage may actually increase the numbers of such person. If you hold up a victim as the thing that is the thing to be, then everyone wants to be a victim. And so people will self-victimize. People will try to come up with some way that they, too, can join the big party of the victims. And that's not, nobody wants to, I mean, yes, some people want to, but that's not good. You're taking away your own agency. You're robbing yourself of your potential. And so what can we do about this? Well, I think it'd be interesting to do more research, follow the money, find out how these people are being funded. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of money involved necessarily, though, in radicalizing people online. You just find these communities of either marginalized or underrepresented or somehow just people that are lost, people who are looking for a meaning or a crusade, and give them this to do. Social justice sounds great in theory, and then it's been completely perverted and used against itself. I mean, what we have now is not helping the oppressed. It's oppressing them further, and it's making a big mess out of a political movement that wanted to help them. Expose these people for what they are, which is frauds. Just dialogue among other people on the left. This is a drag queen story hour, humor, I don't know.
Getting ready for work. A meticulous process that involves shaving,
even the
glitter,
most gay rights supporting person might have a problem with sending their 3-year-old to the Park Slope Library to have a drag queen.
The venue is the Brooklyn Public Library in Park Slope at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Who wants to be a drag queen when they grow up?
Little Miss Hot Mess.
Who is ready for a story?
Is the host of Drag Queen Story Hour.
This one is called Worm Loves Worm.
Talking, singing, and reading.
We can both be grooms.
To an audience of preschoolers, toddlers, and their caregivers.
The hips on the drag queen go swish, 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 swish.
It's catchy, right?
The library started scheduling Drag Queen Story Hour last year.
I'm a girl.
And is already looking to expand to other locations.
Drag Queen Story Hour is fantastic because it addresses all of
Look how worried
these
she looks.
issues of gender fluidity and
terrified someone's going to
self-acceptance,
call her out.
and all of these topics that are real, are very, very real.
And so is the backlash. Many negative comments have been posted online about the program. The AP has agreed not to use the drag queen's legal name because he said he feared harassment.
But those are people who think that gay people are sinful or evil or, bad to begin with.
And this is the black and white
so,
thinking.
We're sort of just starting from such different places that it's kind of irrelevant.
Basically, that if you don't support a drag queen reading to your 3-year-old child, then you are a bigot and you must hate gay people and think they're sinful and evil. And everybody knows, that's common sense. So that's pretty much it for my presentation. So thank you.
Thanks all for coming. I'll just like to finish it off by saying that, like ISIS, this is easy to do. What you do is you take the very worst aspects of an ideology, compress it into one group. That group claims to be at the vanguard of the ideology. Social justice warriors are the ISIS of the left. ISIS is not attacking Americans, are not attacking their supposed enemies, Jews. Social justice are not attacking right-wingers. They're not attacking Wall Street. They're not attacking military-industrial attack. They're feeding off their own. They're the ISIS of the left.